Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 5.16, Vietnam War Protesters. It includes information that goes along with the second section on your study guide. Now remember to use your study guide to help you take notes and have control of the lecture. Pause when you need to, write down questions if you have them and bring those to class, and rewatch as often as you need. Let's go ahead and get started. You've learned about how the U.S. became involved in the Vietnam War, and how the war escalated under President Johnson, both in previous notes and in class. We've talked about this. You've also heard about the atrocities of war and read about those in the novel, The Things They Carried. And you've heard about how many Americans began to doubt the U.S. involvement. So today I want to look specifically at both the protesters and the supporters of the war and how these shifted over time. When the Vietnam War began, most Americans supported the U.S. government and the war efforts. Americans believed that communism was a serious threat to American values, safety, and security, and that it could not be allowed to spread unchecked throughout the world. We needed to be involved. These beliefs caused most of America to support the U.S. government actions in the Cold War in regard to the Chinese Revolution, the Korean War, and now in the Vietnam War. They wanted to use containment to keep America safe, and Americans supported this. Many Americans were hesitant, however, to send troops to Vietnam due to the results of the Korean War. Now remember, the Korean War had just ended in 1953, and it was in 1954 that Vietnam was split into two countries. The wounds of Korea and our inability to win there were still very fresh, and we weren't sure about sending troops. However, they were very sure that supplies, aid, and advisors were a good idea for the U.S. to send. So they felt that these pieces that the U.S. sent to Vietnam would help contain communism in Asia, and Americans supported it. At the same time, there was a small group of Americans who believed that the U.S. should not be involved in Vietnam in any way. That was the hippies. Hippies had many different reasons for their protests against the Vietnam War, but as a group, they condemned the U.S. actions there. Some of the reasons that hippies opposed U.S. actions were the fact that they did not believe that war would gain our goals, they felt war was morally wrong, or they wanted to allow Asia and Vietnam to determine their own fate. While not all hippies had the same views on why they did not want to be in Vietnam, they agreed on the what, which was we should not be in Vietnam. Hippies were a small, radical group at the time. They preached love, not war. They lived very non-materialistic lifestyles. Many used recreational drugs to open their minds, as they said, and they rejected many of the traditional American values. Because they did not fit into mainstream society, most Americans were not swayed by the pleas of hippies against the war. However, as more and more Americans saw the horrors of war coming through their nightly television news, actions like the My Lai Massacre and the Tet Offensive, failed military efforts by the South Vietnamese troops, and low morale among soldiers, this allowed more and more mainstream Americans to begin to question U.S. actions and U.S. involvement in the war. Then in 1965, a new type of protest began, one that gained more mainstream support: teach-ins. The first was held at the University of Michigan in March of 1965, and it focused on all aspects of the Vietnam War. These actions, these protests, were groups where people could learn about the war, ask questions, and then come up with plans for action. So it was really about getting together and discussing in large groups with experts talking that you could ask questions to. There were no time or content limits. Students began to learn more about what their friends and former classmates were experiencing, and they took that out into the world. More and more Americans started to question the war. Then, in 1969, the U.S. began to draft soldiers for the first time since 1942 and World War II. And remember, the war is not declared. So young men who did not want to be a part of the war could be called to serve, and serve in a war that had never been declared by Congress, and that they didn't sign up for and didn't support. More and more people questioned not only this action, but as more and more issues arose in Vietnam, like drug use, unprepared soldiers, and the horrors of war, more and more people questioned the U.S. being there in the first place. Was that what we wanted for our country, for our future? That meant that more people questioned President Johnson, which we'll talk more about in the next set of notes. This is the end of 5.16. Hopefully you learned something.